use doll secrets to detect. It's the name you trust, the doll detective.
Some cases slide into the past. Ink dries, the lights flicker low, the files get buried in silence. But tonight, the air hums with something different. Tonight, we've got a thinker who doesn't just watch from the sidelines. He crawls through the gutters of culture, dusting for prints where others see only shadows. Dr. Kenneth Hanson, assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wyoming, stakes his claim where desire, tech, and taboo intersect in the fog. His dossiers, sex tech, forbidden longings, and the secret ways we shape meaning in the dark between the headlines. He's the one who's gone deep, mapping the cold touch of silicone companions, the stories owners whisper into their silence, and what it all says about power, gender, and the edges of intimacy. No sensational headlines, just the raw evidence pointing to a line that's disappearing fast between flesh, circuits, and soul. So pour yourself something strong, kill the overheads, and pull up a chair in the shadows. Tonight in the Interrogation Room, Dr. Kenneth Hanson, uncovering the dark truths we're afraid to face when connection slips beyond our control. Glad you came willingly.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
What was the crack in the perfect veneer that dragged you into this murky world where dolls, robots, and human desire dance in the dark? Was there a moment, a clue, a whisper in the shadows that flipped the whole case wide open?
Yeah, so I was a PhD student at the University of Oregon. I just finished my comprehensive exams, so it was time for me to start thinking about my dissertation topic. I didn't know where I wanted to go at the time. I was reading an article, I want to say it was Vice News maybe, somewhere like that, and they casually mentioned the price tag of real dolls at something like $8,000, I think. So my research question began as, why would somebody spend that much money on a sex toy? So I did what any researcher does. I went into the literature, started reading about what people have done, and I found that most people were not actually talking to people that were buying this technology or using it. Most people were perfectly fine just writing theoretical pieces, think pieces. Much of it I felt was unnecessarily critical, or at least not trying to understand users' perspectives. And so I set out with the goal of trying to not prove whether or not sex dolls are good or bad, or the people that use them are good or bad. You know, I'm a scientist first and foremost. I want to approach it objectively, but I wanted to actually hear from the people, collect data, and then draw my conclusions from there.
Doc, they certainly can get pricey. I've dumped a few grand myself.
Yeah, I mean, I found that the more research you do, you realize that real dolls kind of the Ferrari or the Cadillac, right? It's the more expensive models. There's obviously much cheaper ones, and then you realize there's also a pretty robust secondhand market. So not everybody that's getting into this is spending that kind of money, but some definitely do.
Yeah, Doc, I always tell folks to start small. Get a feel for it without going all in. Once you're sure it's right for you, then you upgrade. No need to rush into the deep end. So, Doc, was there a moment, a clue, a piece of evidence you stumbled on that changed everything?
I can think of two moments where I was really shocked by what I was researching, and shocked in a good way. One was an interaction I saw unfold on the doll forum, where a young guy, maybe in his 20s or so, came on and he made a thread talking about how he's having a hard time finding a partner and he was just going to give up on it. and wanted advice about buying a doll. And some people commented on it, and they said, not what I would expect them to say, which is, things about this is the model you should get or whatever. They said, hey, listen, honestly, you're a young guy, you're in your 20s. Lots of people go through heartbreak. Lots of people have a hard time finding a partner. And you are young enough that you should stick with it, because finding a good partner or having kids, those are good things, and they're really fulfilling things. And of course, if after a couple more years it's still not working out, or you have a long relationship and it ends in divorce and you want to come back, we'll still be here, but we don't want you to throw in the towel so quickly. And I thought that was a really interesting interaction, really flying in the face of stereotypes about this being, people that are misogynistic or like anti-marriage or anti-child and stuff like that. So that was a very interesting moment. I think the other one that really blew my mind was when I was going on Twitter and Instagram and finding different people who had made accounts for their dolls, and they were posting as if they were the doll, or from the doll's perspective, I guess. And I mean, just how elaborate these profiles were and how convincing they were. And then I was looking in the comments, and I saw that people were responding to the profiles as if they were real. So I think it was like tricking people that didn't know. And that was another moment where I was like, wow, this is really something different than what I thought it might be.
So, Doc, you've seen some telling moments. The young man who got dismissed, the dolls coming to life on Instagram, pieces of loneliness and connection in a world that often misunderstands. Doll owners face a lot of stigma and judgment. From your perspective, why do you think society casts such a shadow over them? And when you look past the stereotypes, what truths have you found in those hidden stories?
It's a good question, Detective. So I think the stigma comes from a couple of places. One is that there has not been a strong support for men's sex toys. If we look at like the vibrator, for example, it's often looked as a crowning achievement of feminist movements trying to reclaim women's sexuality. And I think it has largely succeeded in that endeavor. There has not been a similar sort of cultural valuation of men's sexuality, especially straight men's sexuality is seen as pretty basic. Like, it doesn't need a lot to become aroused. It doesn't need a lot to orgasm. Pornography is kind of seen as the most somebody might need. So taking men's sexuality further with a sex toy is seen as excessive or salacious. So I think that's part of the stigma is, these are men that are seen as taking sexuality too seriously. I also think, of course, there's the stigma around people who are opting to not be in relationships. That is seen as odd. And then people question, well, why wouldn't they want to be in a relationship? Is it because they have mental health problems that they're not addressing? Is it because they're violent or misogynistic and women aren't able to be with them or don't want to be with them? So those are some of the main areas of stigma I see. And I think that getting to your second question of how this stacks up against reality, one of the main points that I try to get across in a lot of the research I do and the talks that I give is that while the majority of doll owners are straight men, it is not a homogenous community. There are a lot of users who are women, are queer, are in relationships even, so it's not even just a single person's thing. So that's one of the first stereotypes that I try to push back against, that yes, the majority is this one group, but it's not the entirety, and so that points to something more complicated going on. And then I think the other thing is people don't realize that most doll owners have had some measure of success with relationships. Many of them have been married. Many of them have been in long-term relationships where they cohabitated. Many of them have had children. And so really, most of them are coming into doll ownership later in their life, middle age, even to elderly years, because now that that period of time in their life has ended, when they've been in relationships and had kids, they see themselves as moving into the next phase of life. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask, like, why would I need to get married again if I'm in my 50s and I've already checked the box on these major lifestyle achievements that people expect us to do: get married, have kids, buy a house, etc. I don't need to do it again. I like my house. I like my life. I like doing what I want to do. And this is a way for me to meet emotional and sexual needs without complicating things further.
There's a quiet stigma around men's sexuality and choosing solitude. Most people don't see the full picture. Many doll owners have walked real paths in relationships, but now find solace elsewhere. I've witnessed how giving names and life to these dolls speaks to something deeply human. Doc, from your research, when someone engages with a doll or robot, are they reaching for tools, companionship, or something even more profound?
That is a tough question to answer. I don't know that it's an either or sort of thing. I think the usefulness or the utility of the doll is really in the eye of the beholder, which might sound kind of trite. But for some people, they are definitely tools. You know, you yourself talked about how you use them for photography. There's a number of people in the community that also use them for photography, and not really much else. And I think a lot of that is because it's a hobby, or because they want to do erotic photography and it's hard to find erotic models, especially if it's just a hobby and you're not a professional. So they serve a very discrete function in those sorts of situations. For other people, their partners, they get a lot of emotional benefits out of having them. I've listened to many doll owners talk about it being, I don't mean to say this like I'm trivializing it, but they'll compare it to like a dog or another animal, like just the fact that you have something that has a presence in the room with you can be very comforting, and you're able to love that thing. Maybe not in the same way that you would love another person, but that doesn't mean that it's not love. There's also a lot of technology enthusiasts in the community that get really into the immersiveness of using dolls in conjunction with social media, in conjunction with AI chatbots, in conjunction with things like replica and augmented reality. And I've heard a couple of people talk about how when they're being intimate with their doll, it tricks their reptile brain, and for a moment they kind of forget that they're having a sexual interaction with a doll. So I think for some people it's about trying to blur that line between reality and the experience they're creating and trying to get lost in it almost. I think of it as kind of like a sexual version of a drug-fueled night, right? Where you're just kind of getting lost in the ecstasy of the moment and forgetting where your skin ends and the skin of somebody else begins.
Forgetting where your skin ends and the skin of somebody else begins? I like that. But yeah, that's a tough one. Like walking a shadowed line with no clear end. For some, dolls are art, a hobby, or comforting companions with a presence that feels real. Technology, especially when mixed with AI, can fool our primal minds, drawing us into intimate moments that feel surprisingly alive. So tell me, Doc, what does giving dolls names and personalities tell us about the real emotions and needs people are expressing when they connect with these machines?
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me is, again, most doll owners are straight men, right? And so the dolls that they're personifying are usually women, sometimes straight women, sometimes bi-curious women or something like that. But at any rate, through personification, they develop these hyper feminine personas. And I think it becomes a vehicle for men being able to feel safe psychologically, personally, I'm not really sure, but they feel safe to explore things that they might not otherwise feel safe exploring as men. So, for example, I've spoken with some men who they realize, it's really hard to find bras that fit my doll properly. And so I got really into sewing so that I could create customized lingerie that fits my dolls correctly. Most straight men would never talk about the fact that they're into sewing, especially not sewing custom lingerie. But they get really into this hobby that's seen as like a feminine practice, sewing, especially lingerie. Or they get really into makeup, they get really into doing hair, they get really into female coded literature or music or things like that they're using to personify and create a more convincing reality for their doll. But I think there's also an internal pleasure that they get from exploring these new things that they wouldn't otherwise do. Because straight men are going to do what? They're going to sit around, they're going to play guitar, talk about Pink Floyd, talk about UFC, kind of like the boys will be boys stuff, but that's not the end of the world. There's a lot of other stuff that men might want to do, and dolls provide an outlet for that for some people.
You're right, Doc. Boys will be boys, but these dolls aren't just companions. They open doors to side hobbies like clothing and sewing, offering an outlet for creativity and care. Considering that, you've seen two distinct paths, the anime-inspired fantasies from the East and the lifelike forms from the West. What do these different choices reveal about the hidden fears and desires beneath the surface?
Interesting question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it, but I wrote a paper with a media psychologist named Nicola Doring and one of her grad students named Roberto Walter. They're out of Europe. And we were interested in this question of what do dolls that are being currently sold on the market really look like, and how well do they match up to human bodies? So you hear all the time that they're hyper feminine, they're hyper gendered, they're hypersexualized, etc. We were curious if that could actually be empirically demonstrated. So we took a bunch of data from a sex doll wholesale website that lists all of the different measurements, right? The height, the waist, the hips, the bust, the leg length, all of this stuff. And we compared that data to the best data that we could find on the U.S. population. So we're pulling from different studies because you have some studies that are maybe just focused on like the racial demographics of the United States. You have some studies that are focused on the height of men and women in the United States, some that are looking at penis length, etc. So we do all these comparisons, and we find that probably unsurprisingly, yes, they are hypersexualized. The men have very large penises. They have six packs. The women have large breasts and small waists. Nothing really surprising there. What we did find that was surprising is an overrepresentation of Asian women. So, and this is, you get into weird territory here because can a doll have a race in the same way that a human can? No, of course not. They're not biological. But it's clear that they're trying to be constructed in a way that approximate a certain racial phenotype, right? So white women dolls are the most common, and then Asian women are the next most common. And the number of Asian dolls, Asian women dolls in particular, is much higher than we would expect in a U.S. population. So clearly there must be something going on there. Either there are Asian men in the United States and North America who are buying other Asian dolls, so there's a homophily aspect that we could consider, or it's white men who are buying Asian dolls, and so they have an interracial interest in this category. And then you get into questions of supply and demand. Is this something that the industry is making because that's what users want? Or is it that the industry is making it because that's what they think people want, and then people just buy it because that's what's available? It's really hard to say because this data isn't matched up with like user buying preferences. We weren't able to get something that discrete. But I think what it does point to, at least, is a couple of things. One is there's a conflation with Asian women and femininity in pornography, where Asian women are seen as like the sort of seductive dragon empress. We can think of like somebody like Lucy Liu in Kill Bill or something like that. And how that's fetishized in pornography is bleeding over into the sex doll market. So what's happening in the adult industry is coming over and influencing how these designs are being built. I think that's probably the most obvious explanation, but I would love to hear more from doll owners themselves about, why are you buying Asian dolls? Why are you not buying white dolls? What is it about them specifically that you want? It could be even as simple as they're smaller and they're easier to carry. It could be a purely like a material physicality aspect, but it might be something more interesting about culture or femininity or sexual preferences that we just don't have the data on right now.
There's something profound in how people are drawn to dolls that feel exotic or different, an echo of our deeper desire for variety and novelty. Diversity in all its forms stirs the imagination and breaks the routine of the familiar. These choices reveal the intricate dance between curiosity, longing, and the human need to explore what lies beyond our everyday experience. And now, we have AI dolls.
Yeah, well, the industry is definitely trying to capitalize on people that want to have dolls as partners, and they're doing that by bringing in AI. They're doing that by making them more realistic. One of the more troubling trends that I see is there's a number of dolls that are being advertised falsely as having AI. So they are picking up on the trend that people are interested in AI. They know that people want deeper immersive interactions. And so in the little bio or product description of the doll, they'll allude to this doll having AI or robotic capabilities, but it actually doesn't. So there's some bad practices going on in the industry. And I think some of that comes back to there's a lot of lack of regulation in the adult industry because it's seen as dirty, right? Like legislators don't want to get involved. The most they ever really want to do is ban pornography and things like that. Who wants to be a politician and your platform is, I want to have better regulation in the adult industry, right? Like that's political suicide. So it creates space for bad actors in these industries who want to take advantage of users or consumers.
I'm always rooting out the bad actors, those who distort something deeply human for the worst reasons. But if dolls and robots shed their shadows and stepped into the light, embraced as part of everyday life, would desire finally be freed from its chains? Or would it lose its meaning, fading like smoke on the wind?
That is a question that has plagued sexuality scholarship for decades at this point, because we see similar questions being raised about vibrators. We see similar questions being raised about same-sex marriage, about, polyamory, about, drag. Because it's at the root of it, there's a similar sort of question, right? About do we need to just destigmatize all transgressive sexual practices and let people do what they want to do? Or is the problem like the entire culture itself, and we need to upend and like rethink desire and bodies and sexuality from the ground up? And so I don't know that mainstreaming dolls will necessarily lead to liberation, because I don't think that we've seen liberation arise from any other major sexual revolution. The vibrators have not led to women's total and complete liberation. Same-sex marriage has not led to same-sex individuals being completely liberated. And there's still a lot of pushback culturally and politically against those groups in the United States and elsewhere. So even if doll owners became more visible, it's not going to suddenly make people accept them or suddenly make people feel like this is a good thing that we should allow. If anything, more visibility is going to bring more pushback and more critique. So personally, I have a hard time articulating where I fall, because I do agree that the stigma is overbearing and needs to be loosened and rethought, and people should feel free to be themselves and express their desires. But I'm hesitant to say that liberation is necessarily going to follow publicity.
That's a sharp point. True liberation rarely comes overnight, and stigma often fights harder than progress. If dolls and robots echo those same old patterns, do they just reinforce traditional gender and power dynamics? Or is there a chance they're quietly rewriting the script altogether?
Yeah, well, I think the gender norm question is in some ways the $1 million question, or the one that I think is asked most often. And this is really the question that I saw in the literature when I first got interested in this topic, because a lot of different people wanted to ask that question and were more or less in agreement that yes, it does reinforce these problematic gender representations. And I go back and forth on this. Personally, I think that it does both, right? It does offer new opportunities, but it also reinforces things, because I think there's two agents here that are at work. I think the industry is reinforcing ideas about gender because they are the ones that are designing dolls in very limited ways. They are only offering certain options to people because that's what they think is the most marketable, the most sellable, most profitable. So the industry is very much invested in these hierarchical systems of gender that go back to, big boobs, passive women, large penises, six-pack, strong men sort of ideas. On the ground, I see a lot more room and play with ideas about gender and sexuality from the users. And so in that way, I'm not a technological determinist. I don't think that technology determines the way that people are going to use the technology. I think people are always going to innovate, hack, find ways around things. And so there's a lot of users that are using dolls in very interesting ways that push back against these rigid gender norms. Not all of them. Some of them definitely do not. But, like I said earlier, there's a lot of queer people that I've met that have dolls that like the ability to swap the genital configurations. There's people that are using dolls in like swinging or group sex environments. There's people that are dressing their dolls up in ways that don't align with normative gender presentations. So the dolls themselves are built in ways that reinforce gender scripts, but they're not being used in ways that reinforce normative gendered scripts.
The dolls come dressed in old stories, but the way people use them, that's a whole different story, Doc. As a detective who's peeled back the layers of law and disorder, I want to know, how does the legal system grip intimacy with dolls and robots? What legal or ethical battles are lurking in the shadows, showing just how messy this all really gets?
So good question when it comes to the criminal justice system. There are two main issues that the criminal justice has with dolls. One is any doll that appears to be childlike is going to be classified as child pornography, which is obviously illegal, right? And so this gets into questions of pedophilia, or as some folks in the literature call it, minor attracted persons. So that's one issue, and that's a whole box of worms that we can go into more detail on if you want. The other side is there have been a couple of cases where the faces of dolls appear to be very similar to actual people, and people have found those dolls one way or another, and then they sue the companies or try to take legal action for using their likeness without their permission. Now, in those cases, the question becomes a burden of proof, right? Is it just a coincidence that you and this doll kind of look similar, or can you actually prove that the company in question is somehow getting your image off social media or whatever, and then using that to inform their designs? And because a lot of these companies are in China and Asia, they're not exactly trying to cooperate on those cases. Then, as for the complexity issue, I think one of the more interesting problems we see is around age of consent laws. So in the United States, for example, pornography have to be at least 18 years old to access it, have to be 18 years or older to act in it. That's pretty similar across most Western countries. But in Asia, some of the countries, the age of consent is 16. And so cross-culturally in pornography, there's always going to be this fetishization of the legal line, right? Barely legal, 18, 19 type of stuff. So in those countries where these dolls are being made, they're being made in ways that fetishize their line of 16 years old or 17 years old in a way that's perfectly legally consistent there. But when they ship that doll to, say, Australia or England or the United States, once it crosses the border, it has now become child pornography because the legal definition of the age of consent and the age of accessing pornographic materials is higher in those countries. So that leads into some legal quagmires as well, where the companies are not at fault. It's the person trying to import it who's at fault for trying to bring child pornography in. Those are some of the main areas we see the criminal justice system coming into play.
Doc, that could be a topic for a whole nother show.
Yeah, and there's a couple of different companies that are doing some different things too that I think people aren't aware of probably. So there are some childlike dolls that, like other sex dolls, you could have intercourse with. But then there are some other companies, I can't remember their names off the top of my head. Maybe it's best that I can't. But they create dolls that are much smaller, so maybe the size of a Barbie or a little bit bigger, that are anatomically correct. So they have genitals, they have nipples, but you couldn't have sex with it, right? And so that kind of gets into an interesting question of like, well, is this child pornography? It's not the same as a sexual aid or a sex toy, but they are more realistic looking, so people might be drawn to them because of their realism. And then there's also some, questions about, well, is it childlike because it's small, or is the face actually made to look like a child? One of the things we talked about earlier was, size and weight concerns are a problem for elderly people. So a doll that's maybe only 4'6" might be appealing to somebody who has a hard time with the weight of a doll. And even if it has an adult-looking face, the fact that it's 4'6" is going to make people question, well, is this really supposed to be an adult?
Sure, it gets murky. Laws shift depending on where you stand, and lines blur in the shadows. I don't back childlike dolls, plain and simple. But I've seen folks who prefer smaller sizes just for the weight or ease of hiding them. It's a different story altogether, one tangled in its own dark corners.
Another legal matter that I don't think it's talked about very much, but is of interest to me and at least a couple other people in the field, is the potential for dolls to be used to reduce prison violence and prison rape. So we know that prison rape is epidemic in at least U.S. jails and many other jails. And so might dolls be something that we could use to reduce that? Unfortunately, prisoners are not seen as a group that needs a lot of rights or protections, and sexual violence is almost seen as like this extra punishment that goes on top of the punishment of being in prison. That's in some ways in the United States almost seen as a good thing. And so I don't agree with that personally. And so anything we could do to maybe lessen prisoner violence and prisoner rape is something that I'm interested in.
Using dolls to solve problems in prison. That's a risky play, Doc. But it raises the question, are these companions truly healing wounds or just reflecting the dark corners we'd rather keep hidden? Some say dolls heal, others say they warn. Do they hold up a mirror to loneliness, unlock keys to freedom, or reveal something deeper and darker lurking beneath?
It's a good question. I think that it goes back to the technological determinist stuff we were talking about earlier. It's, for me, a matter of how are people using these, and a lot of people are using them as medicine. A lot of people are using them to deal with problems in their personal life, but a lot of them are also using them to explore sexual fantasies and sexual desires. That's not treating a problem per se. That's just a way to explore something they weren't able to do before. The question of loneliness is an interesting one. Loneliness has been something that I've been interested in and other people are interested in, because we're seeing that the number of people who say they're lonely is up all across the country and all across the world even. We're seeing this in, different cultures, different nations. We're seeing that marriage intentions are low. We're seeing that child rearing expectations are low. And so the question is, why are people not getting married? Why are they not having kids? Why are they lonely? People are worried about what are the consequences of that long term? Why is that happening? There's a lot of different reasons. When we look at the data on young people, there's a couple of things that become clear. One is that they're deeply affected by COVID. COVID locked a lot of them out from major life milestones that we would expect people of that age to go through. Getting their first car, losing their virginity, high school graduation, living in a dorm at college, things like that. All major markers and significant moments in a young person's life, young adult's life. We also know that a great number of them are very worried about the economic future. They don't feel like they're going to be able to get good jobs. They feel like they're going to be overburdened by debt. They feel like they're never going to be able to buy a house. And so why would they get married and have kids in a small apartment that they can barely afford? A lot of them are also worried about global climate change and worried about what the future is going to look like for their kids if forest fires are burning and raging and there's massive droughts. There's also some interesting stuff going on politically. We know, for example, that Gen Z is one of the least religious groups ever, and it's the first cohort where women are even less religious than men. Historically, men are less religious than women, basically going back as far as we've been keeping track of this. But for Gen Z, something like 40% of women want nothing to do with religion, and a lot of that has to do with the way that religion is seen as coinciding with conservative politics. And so we see there's a huge discrepancy between Gen Z men and women politically as well as religiously. Gen Z women very much left, very much not in favor of Trump. Gen Z men are a bit closer to 50-50 conservative Democrat. And globally, there's kind of a similar trend as far as right-left religious convictions and stuff. And so that cohort is probably even lonelier than previous ones, and we expect the trend to continue of them being lonely and not getting married and having kids. And so, I think this comes back very nicely. It's one of those first things we talked about today is, I remember a young man going on the doll forum and saying that he wants to buy a doll, and people saying, no, you should try and get married, you should try to have kids, like those are really fulfilling things to do in life. And then, come back in 5, 10, 15, 20 years if it doesn't work out, or if it does work out, but, you want to get a doll anyways. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I think we're going to see more young people drawn to these technologies. And I think with AI in particular and things like Replica, there's a much lower barrier in cost of entry, right? $80 a year is a lot easier to swallow than a couple $100 or a couple $1,000 up front to buy a doll. Plus, it's on your phone, right? It's not something that you have to hide when company comes over. It's not something that you have to pick up and carry. And we're already seeing that young people love digital stuff anyways, right? They love gaming, they love social media. So I think these AI tools are going to really fit into this loneliness thing. We'll see if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably a little bit too early to tell. But for me as a sociologist, my big thing that I come back to is, how do we address the structural problems that make people feel like marriage isn't even a good option in the first place? And for me, that comes back to, obviously, we got to get our economic system sorted out. We have to make an economy and a debt structure and an education structure that actually rewards people for hard work and makes them feel like they're going to be able to achieve their goals, rather than feel like they're being punished for going to school because of how expensive it is, and seeing that as a barrier to getting through life rather than a way to climb the social ladder.
In a world where even love goes digital and old promises begin to lose their shine, it's no wonder we find ourselves chasing the glow of the artificial. Have you seen any trends emerge as more people turn to AI and digital companions instead of traditional relationships, Doc?
There's a really interesting trend in the literature to focus on sex robots. People are really excited about them, want to talk about them. The truth of the matter is that there's not that many sex robots out there. The vast majority of users are using dolls or AI, sometimes both AI and dolls in conjunction with each other, but actual sex robots are really rare. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is technologically, it's extremely difficult to make a robot that can walk in a way that is convincingly human. And, just the cost barriers behind making something like that that's also a market viable product. And so it's interesting to me that scholars have probably written more papers and books about sex robots than the actual number of sex robots that exist, when I think we need to spend more time talking to doll owners, because I find that there's a split between some doll owners are 100% on board with robotics, 100% on board with AI. They're like, yes, I love it. I want it to be as sophisticated as possible. Sign me up. But there are some who are like, no, I don't want AI. I don't want robots. Part of the fun, part of the enjoyment of this life is having something that I get to personify, something that I get to create a social media profile for, something that I get to dress. And if we actually succeed in creating a sentient or a thinking robotic entity, that's going to take that away from me, right? Like, they actually find the process of bringing it to life what's enjoyable. So to assume that everybody wants sex robots, to assume that sex robots are the technological endpoint that we're moving towards, I think is missing a really important part of this practice, the creativeness, the desire to engage with other people who are in this hobby. Like, it kind of misses the point a bit.
Makes sense, Doc. Truth is, I'd rather let my imagination run wild than be spoon-fed some preset personality. Half the fun's in creating the story myself. What about you?
Yeah, I saw a really good quote about, I can't remember who it was. I think she was like an editor for a book publisher or a magazine or something who passed away, but she said something really profound about technology and how anytime you give something to technology, that part of your brain turns off. And there are certain parts of our brain that it's nice to turn off. Like, I like the fact that I don't have to remember a bunch of phone numbers anymore. I can just put that in my cell phone and move on. But we have to stop and think, are there certain parts of our brain that we don't want to turn off? And if we give it over to technology, the ability to write, the ability to think critically, the ability to think creatively, are we going to turn off a part of our brain that really shouldn't be turned off?
Funny how some parts of the brain go dark when technology takes the wheel. Guess we're wired to keep others burning bright. So, Doc, where do you stake your claim in the twisted streets of the doll community?
I'm definitely more pro than against. I try not to put myself in either camp. I try to remain somewhat objective as possible, but I think there are probably more benefits than there are negatives on the whole. I would say that one thing that I wish I could erase from the discourse is any notion that people that buy dolls are necessarily deficient in some way. This, negative stereotype that these are sad people or freaks or whatever really does not hold up to scrutiny. The vast majority of doll owners that I've talked with are really interesting people. They've got fantastic creative outlets. They're easy to talk to. They're successful in other aspects of their life, socially, personally, professionally, creatively, etc. So, to think about it as this like thing that people are using to meet a deficit is a really problematic thing. And even if there are some doll owners that are really struggling socially, that doesn't make them any less deserving of our help and our empathy and our care. And so to be dismissive of the group is really troubling to me.
If there's one thing you could stake on the table, one secret the community should walk away with, what would it be, Doc?
The one thing that I wish everybody could take away from my research and the work that I'm doing about doll owners in the industry is that the majority of the negative things that I see are a result of the industry. The users are, by and large, wonderful people, and they are very much aware of the fact that the industry is doing problematic things. They are aware of the fact that these are just dolls. They are not, sentient beings. The problematic stuff is coming from the top down. And so if we really want to change things, whether it's the way the dolls are made or the ways that the technology is being sold or marketed or whatever, we have to start with the sex tech industry and the fact that it is a overall for-profit industry that is not well regulated and is fully willing to take advantage of people.
In a world where shadows lengthen and the lines between human and machine blur, the doll industry stands at a crossroads, ripe with promise, yet riddled with pitfalls. The lack of regulation leaves the door wide open for those ready to exploit the vulnerable, turning dreams into dangerous territory. But beneath the surface, there's a deeper story of desire, loneliness, and the search for connection that defies simple answers. This is the city where innocence meets invention, and every question carries its own shadow. Now, before this case file closes, Doc, any last words for the interrogation?
If you're interested in reading any of my recent research, I would suggest picking up a book called Sex Work Today, Erotic Labor in the 21st Century, where me and a colleague, Alexis Smiley Smith, wrote the last chapter called Cybrothel, the world's first AI sex worker, which is about, you guessed it, a sex doll brothel based in Berlin, Germany.
A sex doll brothel. Now that is a story you don't stumble over every day. Sounds like a place where even silence has a price. I'll be chasing that lead with a future guest, so keep your ears sharp and your shadows close. Doc, thanks for playing your part in this dark tale.
Thanks for having me. It was a fun way to spend my morning.
Until the next case, this one's closed, and the day's still young.